Canada has just signed a historic $214 billion trade deal with Japan and the European Union, while the United States tightens its tariffs and, watches cautiously from the sidelines. What does this pact mean for the backbone of NAFTA, now the USMCA, and above all for the prices we pay for cars, food, and energy across the continent? The news broke like thunder at first light. Canada, Japan, and the European Union had just signed a trade pact in Ottawa worth $214 billion. The moment the headline hit the wires, Bloomberg and Reuters terminals flashed in red, and Washington was left flat-footed. Analysts, hungry for details, dissected the deal in real time. $78 billion will go to battery and critical mineral projects, lithium from Canada's Northern Triangle, nickel from Sudbury, and cobalt refined under Western standards to reduce reliance on China. $52 billion will fund the expansion of EV and auto parts plants in Ontario and Quebec, in exchange for near duty-free access to European and Japanese markets. $46 billion will underpin a sovereign cloud for artificial intelligence, with twin data centers in Montreal, Osaka, and Frankfurt, linked by encrypted fiber and kept beyond U.S. oversight. And $38 billion will boost premium agri-foods, durum wheat for Italian pasta, canola for German biofuels, and net-zero beef for Japan's high-end consumer. Beyond the money, the symbolism rattled the White House. Ottawa had struck a trilateral pact that knits together rules of origin and environmental standards, leaving the United States outside the circle. Buried in the treaty's 1,237 pages, highlighted in green by every law firm on K Street, lies the clause that set off alarm bells: a 98% elimination of bilateral tariffs within 3 years, and even more provocative, the so-called green staircase, offering subsidies of up to 10% of capex for any zero-carbon factory built inside the tri-zone, provided it is located outside U.S. territory. The message is crystal clear. A company wavering between Vermont and Ontario can secure fresh financing, guaranteed critical minerals, and a 470 million consumer market by jumping the northern border. No wonder an American Enterprise Institute economist dubbed the provision the most elegant and most provocative industrial magnet of the past 5 years. The signing scene became iconic. Beneath the West Block's glass dome, Prime Minister Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor, raised the document with a measured smile. On one side stood the President of the European Commission, on the other, Japan's economy minister. A banner behind them read, "Predictability builds prosperity," while cameras captured the brief but emphatic applause. 890 kilometers to the south, a trade aide burst into the Oval Office with a last-minute folder. Donald Trump, witnesses say, listened to the summary, pursed his lips, and slammed the desk. "They stole our allies right under our noses." His fury had a foundation. Michigan's future battery supply chain would now run through Canadian plants and, worse for the protectionist narrative, companies could sell to the European Union and Japan without paying Washington's punitive tariffs. The chapter closes on a map of the Atlantic filled with Arrows containers departing Halifax for Hamburg cargo planes taking off from Vancouver for Narita. While in the center, a sidelined United States node sits as trade routes bypass it. With a low drone in the background, one question hangs in the air. Can the planet's largest economy afford to stand idle while its neighbor rewrites the rules of the game? Yet the backstory stretches far before the signing. In April 2024, when the White House doubled tariffs on Canadian steel, executives from Japanese automaker Hino met Ontario officials in Toronto, sketching a patient value chain resilient to Washington's mood swings. Simultaneously, the European Union Trade Commissioner dispatched a technical mission to Alberta to inspect Leduc's lithium deposits. Those discreet but steady trips spun a web of trust that crystallized in March 2025 when Ottawa hosted a critical minerals summit in Banff. There, insiders coined the term tri-fusion, which meant marrying Japanese engineering with European financial muscle and Canada's vast geology. By September, drafts were circulating under the codename Nimbus for the sovereign cloud. Quebec servers cooled by glacial air, protected by European Union privacy law, and powered by Tokyo-designed RISC-CV chips. The initial United States response was, well, surprise. Alarm followed when Ford revealed it might move its Ion Blue superbattery project from Dearborn to Windsor to tap the Green Staircase. Chambers of Commerce in Ohio and Indiana fired off urgent letters to Congress warning that any further tariff squeeze will trigger a capital flight to Canada. Meanwhile, Norway's Hydro and Japan's Sumitomo expressed interest in a joint nickel refinery in Newfoundland, one capable of supplying 15% of Europe's LFP cell market. One barely discussed but honestly potentially explosive detail is the data clause. AI models trained in the sovereign cloud just can't be transferred to servers in jurisdictions with, mass surveillance regimes incompatible with GDPR. So, to put it simply, a Canada-Japan startup developing a large language model would hit regulatory walls if it tried to migrate to AWS in Virginia. In Silicon Valley, some venture capitalists have actually dubbed it a digital Berlin Wall that could, split the information economy into rival blocks. European media hailed the treaty as an alliance of values against U.S. protectionism. Editorials in the Financial Times and Nikkei Asia echoed an unusual warning. The U.S. must choose between leadership and sanctions. The window of opportunity will not stay open. In Ottawa, Carney emphasized bridges and certainty, saying, "We're not in a race to raise the highest tariff, we're in a race to convince businesses there will be no surprises tomorrow." The psychological shock was immediate. Biotech startups planning NASDAQ IPOs inquired about listing on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Boston consultancies reported a 40% spike in calls about Canada's innovation visa. Even deep in America's Farm Belt, the tremor was felt. A consortium of North Dakota durum growers saw its Italian export quota threatened because mills in Barrie could now source tariff-free grain from Saskatchewan. To soften the blow, the U.S. Department of Agriculture proposed bridge subsidies, but the Budget Office warned, "We can't plug every gap a new foreign alliance opens with blank checks." Within hours, CNBC charts compared a 28% plunge in U.S. inbound investment with Canada's 9% rise, showing clearly where opportunity smelled sweet and where uncertainty reigned. Ultimately, this opening chapter lays bare the cold logic of a geopolitical board where geography no longer guarantees commercial loyalty. Canada bet on diversified safe harbors and stable rules. Japan seized the chance to hedge against American protectionism. Europe locked in essential raw materials without Chinese ports or Washington tolls. Meanwhile, the United States watches shipping lanes arc around it, factories eye new postcodes, and the word predictability becomes the sharpest weapon in modern trade. In that tense silence, the White House must decide whether to double down on tariffs, risking deeper isolation, or reclaim a seat at the negotiating table before its value chain position erodes irreversibly. Every day under the pact's rules, one less truck crosses the Ambassador Bridge and another ship sails from Halifax to a port where the stars and stripes no longer set the course. For decades, the North American Free Trade Agreement and its update, the USMCA, worked like a circulatory system in which manufacturing blood flowed without obstruction. 34% of all Canadian exports, from wheat trucks to Pratt and Whitney turbines, crossed the border into the United States, and the Detroit-Toronto corridor epitomized that interdependence, with 3,000 trucks a day shuttling engines, dashboards, and seats back and forth before being bolted into the same pickup. But that binational logic began to fracture in 2023, when the White House doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, raising them from 25% to 50%. Meant to stem the tide of so-called cheap metal, the move drove up stamping plant costs in Windsor and honestly lit the fuse of a cross-border fight that exploded in 2024, when Washington slapped a 35% tariff on every vehicle assembled in Ontario. Ottawa hit back where it hurt special levies on Kentucky bourbon, Florida oranges, and U.S. motorcycles that had long cruised freely on Canadian highways. The cracks quickly showed up in hard business decisions. On General Motors' Oshawa assembly line, executives alerted their supply chain that battery cell production would shift to a new plant in Quebec. Electric vehicles bound for Europe and Japan would sail duty-free from Halifax instead of paying double tolls out of Michigan. At the same time, Alberta ranchers inked preferential contracts with Japanese importers, opening a direct lane to 125 million hormone-averse consumers. In Iowa, soybean growers watched their export share shrink. Chinese processors, once loyal customers, trimmed orders to avoid potential Canadian and European retaliation, directing purchases to Brazil instead. In just 12 months, investment sentiment flipped. Canada logged a 9% rise in foreign direct investment fueled by German and Japanese funds seeking a foothold in the new mega deal, while U.S. inflows fell 28%, according to Commerce Department figures. Money once earmarked for plant expansions in Ohio or Alabama migrated to industrial parks in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, lured by provincial incentives and, above all, by the certainty of avoiding a tariff wall tug-of-war. The turning point came when a reporter asked Canada's trade minister whether he feared further escalation. His answer went viral: "If the United States builds walls, we will build bridges." Republished in Le Monde and Nikkei, the line crystallized a new narrative: Canada as a dependable link between continents, the United States as an introspective fortress. The images told the rest: a render of stacked containers forming a virtual bridge from Toronto to Brussels, overlaid on data showing for the first time in 20 years a drop in truck traffic across the Ambassador Bridge. Politics also shifted. Border state governors requested temporary exemptions to stave off job losses, while Canadian politicians cheered rising industrial employment in Quebec, buoyed by a wave of Asian capital. Auto lobbies that once pushed for stricter rules of origin now pleaded for, regulatory bridges so they wouldn't miss the green tech party funded by the trilateral subsidy ladder. On Main Street, U.S. consumers felt the sting as pickup and appliance prices rose faster than overall inflation, while Montreal supermarkets unfurled Japanese and EU flags over beef cuts and olive oils, whose prices had stabilized under the new trade flow. The paradox was clear. The treaty designed to knit the North American market together was facing its greatest stress test, and the seams were splitting right down the proudest axis, the Midwest manufacturing belt, just as Canada, long seen as the junior partner, became the preferred gateway to two of the world's largest economic blocs. In Washington backrooms, some advisors suggested renegotiating quotas, while others urged ramping up pressure, convinced Canada couldn't sustain the capital inflow. Yet every truckload of auto parts rerouted to a Canadian port, every new cathode plant announced in Trois-Rivières, and every extra ton of Wagyu-grade beef shipped to Tokyo. Well, all of it reinforced the sense that the game was being played by rules the USMCA never anticipated, and on that board, the advantage was tilting toward the player who, instead of tearing down old bridges, simply built new ones. News of the $214 billion Canada-EU-Japan pact triggered an emergency huddle in the West Wing. At 8:30 a.m., Trump slammed a folder on the table and said, "I want a 25% punishment tariff on every Canadian relocated product." Treasury's reply was pretty clear. Such a levy would add about $1,100 a year to the average U.S. household. Rural Republicans balked, warning of voter blowback. Wall Street reacted instantly. Magna International jumped 11% on hopes of new contracts fleeing Detroit, while U.S. steel sank 8%. Tech chatter sent the Nasdaq swinging as cloud giants weighed moving data centers to Quebec to tap the EU-Japan neutral cloud. Trade staff hurried out an executive order draft, Patriot Shield. Any firm accepting foreign subsidies would lose federal contracts for 5 years. White House counsel cautioned that the move would violate World Trade Organization rules and invite costly lawsuits, but Trump barked, "No pain, no victory." Inside the administration, fissures widened. Governors of Michigan and Ohio pleaded for talks with Ottawa to keep plants alive. Trade hawks demanded tighter screws. Outside, the United States Chamber of Commerce aired a primetime ad, "Tariffs are taxes on Americans." Protesters chanted "Jobs, not tariffs" outside the White House while Toronto traders toasted green charts. By noon the order remained unsigned, legality and midterm politics still in play, but the threat alone pushed several multinationals to scout Montreal locations before new red lines hardened. The Canadian dollar ticked higher. Confidence in the trilateral deal held firm, while Washington grappled with whether doubling down on tariffs would protect jobs, or just raise prices at home.